Let's talk about Congress. Congress is how we get legislation done. In the Constitution, remember there was this great compromise. We created a bicameral legislature with the House of Representatives on the bottom and the Senate on the top, equal in power. Senate represents the interests of the state. It's what was the remnant of the Articles of Confederation, except this time we had 2 representatives from each state. The House of Representatives represents the people based on population. 435 of them. Those representatives are distributed after every census, according to how the state draws its boundaries. The bicameral legislature creates a check and balance so that one piece, either the people, House of Representatives, or the states, the Senate, couldn't overrule each other. They have to both agree in order to get some legislation done, to pass laws. Members of Congress are meant to represent the interests of people and also the interests of the states, depending on where they serve. The House was designed to be more accountable. They had shorter terms. They serve only for 2 years. They have looser eligibility requirements, which meant they could anybody could represent them, more or less. The Senate was designed for something different. They have 6-year terms. Only a third of that body switches over every 2 years. But in the House, those people could be all wiped out every 2 years if they wanted. It doesn't really happen that way. We talked about incumbency. Both of them do lawmaking. Both of them do budgets and oversight. Oversight's a really critical role of Congress, where they pass some law and they make sure that it gets done. The House has some very specific powers. They have to introduce spending bills. In other words, they're the ones who have to determine whether or not we take that tax money and how we spend it. They also have the specific power to impeach a president. An impeachment proceeding cannot come from the Senate. It has to come from the House. The Senate also has some really specific roles. The Senate is supposed to ratify treaties. A president goes out and negotiates a treaty with another country, but the Senate has to verify, confirm, ratify that treaty is going to be reasonable, a good deal for us. The Senate also has some other specific powers. So when the president wants to appoint somebody to lead an agency, the Senate has to confirm them. When a president wants to appoint a specific judge to a bench, the Senate has to confirm them. And then the House, if they're doing impeachment, the House has to serve as a grand jury. They have to introduce those rules of impeachment, the articles of impeachment. And then the Senate, they actually conduct the trial if a person is impeached in the House. So Congress gets to split some of these responsibilities with some specific responsibilities sent to the people. And we can look through each of those. Who has what policies? Go look through that in the book. I wanted to talk about budgeting powers. Congress gets to set forth the budget. Remember, we were talking about taxing and spending in that chapter on the Constitution, and talking about the things that led up to the founding. That King George was taxing people. People wanted representation. They wanted to be able to control where those taxes were levied and how much they were levied on them, and how that money was spent. So Congress gets the power to determine how much it gets taxed and spent. They authorize agencies. They give power to agencies to exist. These agencies include like the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Transportation, National Park Service. They also send money through the budget to those agencies so they can do their job. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the amount of money that's required, but those they're just estimates. And so the Congress sends money that they think is appropriate. And sometimes in that budget process, they kind of buy each other's votes. Now, it's kind of weird to say they buy each other's votes, but there are these things called earmarks where money's tagged for a specific agency. And that money goes to that agency to get some job done. But in order to make sure that funding is spent properly, certain senators, members of the House, will say, well, we really want to have some economic stimulus, and it would be really great if some of that economic stimulus went to a dairy producing state, because cattle farmers are really in a tough bind. And so they tag a little bit of that money to go specifically to a state or to a specific project. Those are called earmarks or pork barrel spending. So that increases the amount of budget that gets spent on some areas, and they're really political favors for like incumbent legislators. Now, Congress is given power to oversee the laws and the budgets that each of the federal agencies spend, or in the states. The state legislature does the same thing. They make sure that laws are implemented properly. There's some crisis-driven oversight. Sometimes we call that fire alarm oversight, where there's this massive problem and all these legislators run in to try and save the day, and they call in the heads of these agencies and say, what did you do wrong? And they say, well, we didn't do anything wrong. And they say, well, and then they get like mad at each other. But then there's this routine oversight where members of Congress sit on committees, and these committees watch over specific types of legislation, and they pull the agencies in who implement that legislation. Say, for example, we wanted to make sure that the EPA was doing its job and people were getting clean air. There are committees inside the House and inside the Senate who deal with environmental legislation. So they could call in the head of the EPA or some staff members in the EPA and make sure that they're doing their job, make sure that the air is getting cleaned properly, make sure that the intent of Congress is getting done. That's called oversight. Now, how do people get elected to be members of Congress? Well, some people have to choose, right? And parties try to identify people who will be successful and win. They look at how many resources those people have, what kind of ambition they have, what sort of issues are interest to them, are there important issues that are going on in the country. So a prediction of who's going to run for office might include those things. But in terms of who's going to win, they have to know who their constituencies are. So in Southern California, we've got all sorts of districts, but if you're from a district that produces manufactured goods or is in a port, you kind of have to know the issues that surround jobs in ports and who the people you'll serve will be, and what sort of things will be interesting to them or important to them. Some good predictors of winning office is having won a previous office. Especially if you're an incumbent, you have a higher likelihood of winning. Once again, and being able to leverage money, or have money of your own, or be able to leverage other people's money to win. Those generally predict who's going to go to Congress. Parties organize the work of Congress. So obviously, Republicans and Democrats do this slightly differently, but the Republicans, they want to get people who can win these elections. Once they're in there, those people who've won those elections, they're Republicans, they want to do the party favors. They want to do what the party generally wants. So the majority party, whoever wins the most seats in the legislature, they're the majority party. The head of the majority party, those leaders, they organize their parties. They set out the goals for that legislative session. The same thing happens for the minority party. Right now in the Senate, the Democrats are the minority party and the Republicans are the majority party. It's gone the other way. Like right now in the House, the Democrats are the majority party and the Republicans are the minority party. That flip-flops every once in a while as people win elections. The leaders of those two parties, they try to work all the members of their parties to get them in line to have them more or less work for the same sort of goals. They try and help them win re-election. The Speaker of the House is particularly powerful. They're the head of the House of Representatives. They're the majority party leader in the majority party of the House of Representatives. They can introduce bills. They can also stop bills from showing up or to become laws. The Senate Majority Leader is the leader of the Senate. They have also some specific rules. So those things matter, but also the political party leaders, they get to determine who gets to sit on which committees. Each committee has a specific job or responsibility within Congress. So in the House of Representatives, we have committees on budget, we have committees on veterans affairs, we have committees on agriculture, we have military oversight committees. All of these committees receive potential bills. Anybody who wants to introduce some new law, that new law, a bill, has to go to a committee to make sure that that thing is going to work out well. It's going to be in the interest of the party and of the people. And then it goes out of that committee to get voted on. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also, all of those committees get to review all of those laws that pertain to that area. So they have all sorts of different specializations and different responsibilities. So this is a figure of the structure of leadership in Congress. We can talk about how that leadership is organized. But also, each member of Congress has a staff. That staff member tries to do research. They try to figure out what the constituents in their districts want. They go and draft legislation. They write laws. They interact with constituents. So let's say somebody earns their Boy Scout, Eagle Scout award. That troop of Boy Scouts might contact that representative and say, hey, could we get some special recognition? Well, the staff go out and they do that recognition. So the staff helps organize some of the work that gets done in Congress. Then there are other organizations like the Congressional Budget Office or the General Accountability Office. They do some research for these other members of Congress and for the parties. The other thing that's really, really important in the organization of Congress is that there are specific norms or routinized behaviors or a social structure to Congress. And there are these inherited rules that take place over time, and they become like how we do business. So those are the norms of Congress. One of the norms of Congress, like in the Senate, is the filibuster. It's this rule that says any member of Congress can take, or any member of the Senate can talk about just about whatever they want if they're given power to do that. And they use the filibuster to stop legislation. It takes a certain number of votes to stop that person from speaking. There's also a thing called unanimous consent in the Senate, that if the Senate doesn't want to take up a specific bill, a single member of the Senate can stop that from happening. But if you do that, it undermines all the other bills that might take place. And so even though it's there as an option, it's kind of like this nuclear option that people just don't ever use. That's one of those norms. So the legislative process, if you want to Google something pretty great, it's the Schoolhouse Rocks called I'm Just a Bill. It's a great little video. I think you should see it. But if a bill is going to become a law, it has to be passed in the Senate and the House and signed by the President. But the wording from the bill in the Senate and the wording from the bill in the House have to be identical. They have to be exactly the same piece of legislation in order for it to be signed by the President to become a law. Bills are introduced in either chamber. They're referred to as some committee. The committee marks it up. They change it. They work on it. They rewrite rules. They have hearings. They try and figure out exactly what that piece of legislation should do. If it's approved out of that committee, it goes to the floor of the House or the Senate, wherever it is introduced. If it passes, it moves on to the other chamber of Congress. And it goes through that same process until the words are more or less equal. If it's passed there with the exact wording, then the President can sign it, it can become a law, or the President can veto it. Now that's the sort of general process, but really the process is less clear. Sometimes a bill is referred to multiple committees. The bill can be forced out of a committee, but largely a lot of these pieces of legislation end up getting introduced into the House or the Senate. They get sent to a committee. The committee doesn't act on them, and the bill dies. If the wording is if a law is passed, if a bill is passed in the House and a bill is passed in the Senate and the words aren't equal, it gets referred to what's called a conference committee. And the conference committee tries to reconcile those words so that they're the exact same thing. If that happens, they have to get passed in the legislature and then they can get signed by the President. But there are things that, presidents do that shape bills, that work with specific members of Congress to make sure that the bills come out a certain way, or they can threaten to veto things. And in all honesty, most bills that are introduced in the Congress aren't ever passed. Now, members of Congress sometimes don't pass bills for a variety of reasons. They might like it, but their constituents won't. Their constituents are the people they represent. Sometimes members of Congress really want to pass something, but their political party says don't do it. Sometimes their political party says, yes, vote for the bill, and their constituents won't do it. Or they won't support it. So there are a lot of really complex reasons why members of Congress vote a certain way. The President also might be able to push them around a little bit. Like President Johnson used to call members of Congress in and just berate them and say foul things to them and force them to do his will just because he was a bully. Well, representatives also can get away with some stuff because it's not really clear to their constituents what's going on. But other times, constituents are really active and aware of what's going on in terms of legislation, and they can force a certain member of Congress to behave a certain different way. And a lot of lawmaking occurs outside of public view. It happens in committees where most people don't pay attention. It happens in conferences. It happens with interest groups having some drafting of legislation. They pass it on to a member of Congress who's favorable to that interest, and they move that forward. So it's not a very democratic process in the way that we think about a democracy working, where the people want something and the representatives do that thing and they vote on it. A lot of this is like making sausage. We throw some stuff in here, we throw some stuff in there, and it comes out, and now there's a bill. Is it perfect? No, but at least it's better than it was. Or maybe it's worse than it was. Increasingly, members of Congress are having a hard time working together. Part of that is the increase in party polarization. So like in order for Republicans to have success, they can't really work with Democrats very well without giving the Democrats credit. Or the Democrats really don't want to work with the Republicans because they don't want to give the Republicans any credit. And because of that, it slows down what work of government can happen. We call that gridlock. Divided government is also a problem where the House is controlled by one party and the Senate's controlled by another party, and the president is one of those two parties. When you have unified government where they're all of the same political party, it's a little bit easier to get some of that work done.